Hello, welcome to our podcast about World War II. Our sources are Skolmin, SNL, and other Google searches on the internet. And my name is Kelvin.
My name is Philip.
And my name is Sayed.
Today we're going to presentate the invasion of Norway.
And also, we're going to talk about the interwar period and the swinging 20s.
And then we're going to talk about how the interwar led to the World War II and what happened after the war.
And mostly about the occupation of Norway. So we have chosen the task A, which is what and how do we understand the topic of World War II. So, how and why did the world start? Like, what was the great reason to why the war started in the first place?
The Treaty of Versailles was one of the great reasons why the war started. And it was signed in June 28th, 1919, and it was a contract between the Triple Alliance and the Central Powers, which blamed the war on Germany. And it said that Germany was the only reason why the war started in the first place. So Germany had to pay huge sums of money.
Like, they could not, like, the economy was plummeting to the ground
Yeah,
because it suffered, like, greatly
yeah.
from the debt it had. So, how was it for the other countries? Were they thriving?
Yeah, on other continents and in other countries, they were thriving, almost as if the Great War had never happened in the first place. And this period was called the swinging 20s, and people were investing left and right as though it was the only thing that mattered.
Not to mention, people had often grabbed huge loans from the bank in order to invest more in stocks, and they were planning to pay back when they had earned a profit. Germany had happily borrowed loans from the US, and everything was thriving, and it wasn't much a problem for them yet.
But if things were so great, how did this lead to the Depression period?
Because in October the 28th, in 1929, the stock market's value was suddenly plummeting to the ground, and this led everyone to sell their stocks, which just worsened the state of the problem. And as a result, the stocks were now worth nothing, and they were practically valueless. But since everyone had borrowed loans from the bank, almost all of them were now in severe debt.
Yeah, and obviously this was a big problem for the banks because all of the borrowed loans were not paid back. So this led to the banks having to shut down due to loss of money. The economy of the US was getting worse and worse, and they had to withdraw the loans which Germany had used.
But since USA had withdrawn loans, it resulted in a catastrophic imbalance in the German economy, because now they were in severe debt more than they were before, and every common family would not have enough to purchase food or common items, because they were considered incredibly luxurious in this period.
And I think the reason why the farmers didn't send out food directly to the people caused by famine was because they hadn't set up an organization in the first place to send the food out to the people. Like, they didn't have enough money to fund and make such an organization to the people, and therefore leading the waste of thousands of pounds of food. All the crops like coffee and reserves were left to decay on the farm fields, right?
Yeah.
But since the USA had withdrawn loans from Germany, the people were suffering even more than before, and this led to the people wanting a clear solution, which Adolf Hitler had exploited to get himself to power. He promised a solution to the people, and they believed him because they had no other choice. But then he became the chancellor in 1933, 30th of January, and eventually the dictator. He had a party which had the ideology Nazism, and eventually leading to invasions of Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, and other small countries.
But what about Norway? When did Germany invade Norway?
While Norway had been invaded on the 9th April 1940 because Germany had suddenly launched an attack on Norway.
And this was because Hitler heard that the Allies were interested in Norway's coast and were now threatening the supply line of Swedish raw ore to Germany.
And this was actually one of the main reasons to why Germany had invaded Norway, because they wanted to secure the supply line of Swedish raw ore back to Germany.
And as soon as Norway was invaded, the parliament and the king left the country the same day, and they were supporting Norway's forces all the way from London.
And eventually Norway had capitulated under Germany's army. This day was marked at 10th June 1940. But since Norway didn't have much of an army, they couldn't fight it, but stood up quite against the fierce force.
And after the invasion, Vidkun Quisling had cooperated with Hitler to control Norway. He was a Norwegian Nazi and he had his own Nazi party, but they didn't come to power. Quisling was expecting that he would be chosen as the person to lead Norway, but then Hitler had put Joseph Terboven in charge of Norway instead.
And Joseph Terboven was a German general who was now in charge of Norway. He was a bit higher ranked than Vidkun Quisling, and was the only person with more power than him was Hitler.
But did the invasion affect the civilians in any way?
Yes, it did actually, because there were suddenly now 300 plus thousand soldiers that both needed food and living space to survive. Not to mention, most of the food Norway had produced was sent back to Germany to feed the soldiers on the front line. Therefore, they had to implement a rationizing system for the civilians, both the soldiers and people living in the country. However, Germans were first in line, and then the civilians could just eat the rest of the food, which the Germans ate. So it wasn't really fair.
And also, soldiers had moved into people's home without their permission and ate everything that they made. One of the time witnesses had experienced this because a German soldier had occupied their living room and lived with them for many months until they finally disappeared.
But while Norway was occupied, there were rebels who sabotaged the Germans' advancements. They sabotaged train tracks, done assassinations, exploded parliament buildings, and many others. In response, the Germans had to use a lot of resources and time to repair the damages.
And during the occupation, people's radios were confiscated. This was to prevent information from other sources than German soldiers and their propaganda advertisements.
But all this didn't last forever, because in 8th May 1945 the Germans retreated from Norway. This was because the day before, 7th May 1945, Germany had surrendered to the Allies' power. After the war, many people had hated the Germans, and if there was anyone that had cooperated with them, they would be executed. For example, was Vidkun Quisling executed by the Norwegians.
And this was the last time Norway had ever used death sentence as a punishment. What about propaganda? How was the younger people affected?
Well, amid the war, Germany has set up many different propaganda posters about anti-Semitism and hatred against Jews, as an act of brainwashing the people and civilians to this mindset in a way like as for altering people's opinions. Some of the younger people might have believed this propaganda and joined the German army to fight on the front lines.
But how did it affect the Jews then?
Well, because when the Jews returned, they were not listened to or believed by anyone. When they told about their Holocaust experience, none of them believed what they said about anything and just ignored them like like before. And in the countries that were in the Allied side, such as Norway, many of the women who fell in love with the German soldiers and who made children with them was called tisketusser in Norway because they had fell in love with the enemies. Tisketusser is a Norwegian word that means like a person who is submissive to to a person, which is like a bad word, and it just means it's like a term to mock women. Yeah.
Yeah, and these women were punished by in the streets by shaving their hair off and mocked up and beaten up in the streets without the parliament or law judging beforehand. As they did their own way of punishing, this was called street justice.
And provided that the women had kids with the Germans, the children would also be bullied by both the adults and the other children at schools, like their daily, everyday life. And they would also probably be moved into another family as like adopted or be just deported back to Germany to live there. Like they weren't accepted in the Norway.
Where did the Tiskertøser go if they were punished?
The so-called Tyskertøser were sent to internment camps to suffer by their actions, and the living conditions inside of the camps were horrible. It was like the Holocaust without the mass killings. Instead, they were just like kept there with little food and water. Many of the women died in the camps, and the deaths were put little to no attention at.
Well, what have you learned from the war? Do you have any ideas?
Well, we've learned that if you enforce your extremist ideas about how society should be governed, such as promoting an exclusive society by Germans, which was what Hitler had believed was best for his people, but only made chaos and suffering to both others and the people he promised. Both sides suffer if one forcefully enforces ideas upon others with force.
And even if the action is done, society will be much less diverse and plainer and more boring. For example, you would only see German people on the streets and even more German people. No Jews, no minorities, and no other ideologies. No organization about sensitive topics. Only one mindset, which is Nazism. And it would be, in a way, like a hive mind.
But how could they have prevented the war from happening in the first place?
Well, the war could have possibly been stopped if the Allies weren't that strict with Germany's punishment, because they could have reduced the toll of the war reparations from Germany, and they could have at least put less blame on Germany and more often just have accepted that the war was over. They could also have been a little fairer with the military restrictions so that Germany didn't feel insulted.
Second of all, if the Soviet Union had declined the offer of an alliance between them and Germany, it might have hindered Germany from invading Poland in the first place, and thus preventing the start of World War II. Because if they did so, they would have to fight against two different fronts, the the East Front.
Basically, the war has shown me how lucky we people who live in peaceful countries are, and mostly how horrific it must be for the people whose everyday life is affected by war. And some people would grow up to be an adult and then forced to fight as a soldier in the front lines. We're lucky to avoid it.
And for me, World War II has affected me how I interpret the world, as if the current effects of the war can still be recognized beyond the scars of the Miraland. Laying bodies in trenches, the suffering of the civilians, soldiers, and many alike. The suffering will never be forgotten, and they will be remembered as brave people for many generations to come.
While for me this opens my eyes and shows me how peaceful it is right now. In most countries we can enjoy our life without fearing any soldiers. Some people may still be affected both physically and mentally, and I can't imagine how it feels like. They lived with the fear of getting killed every day and had to be careful with everything they did so they didn't bother the German soldiers.
What is hard to understand for me is how someone can do terrible things to people, like just to make life better for others.
Yeah, I just don't understand why they do that. Like you kill people just to make more room for other people, such like Germany did in World War II. Like why would you kill someone in order to have more living space? Why can't you just help them live their life? Why do you have to end life to make more life?
Yeah, that's very hard to understand for me.
And I feel like Hitler was a little crazy with his things about the extermination of the Jews and much more.
Yeah, for me it was like they could have showed a bit mercy, like they didn't have to do all the extra things and punish them and kill them without them doing anything wrong.
Mm. They could have just supported their country, but why did they have to the full extent?
I don't know.
Well, throughout the podcast, it has been pretty smooth with the cooperation because we gave each other ideas and suggestions for how we could improve slash refine the podcast we made, and we have learned how Germany had occupied other countries around Europe and which tactic he had used and how he had treated the minorities, Jewish people, and other countries based on racial hierarchies. Basically, thanks for listening. It's been Kelvin,
Philip.
And Sayad.
and goodbye.